Please be seated. Thank you for coming, and welcome home, any of you who happen to be here instead of outside having fun. My lecture is entitled Montesquieu's Persian Letters, Comic Vanity, Tragic Pride. Now, I realize many of you, probably most of you, will never have opened the book, the Persian Letters. There's plenty of background in here, so I don't think that would be a hindrance. Montesquieu is best known for his Spirit of the Laws. It is a major work of political philosophy that profoundly impressed the American founders and broadly influenced later political and sociological thought. His Persian Letters is, on the surface at least, a much lighter work. It is, as the author says, a kind of novel, in particular an epistolary novel and among the first of its kind. The book consists of a series of letters purportedly written by Persian travelers and their acquaintances. Montesquieu poses as a mere translator. The letters highlight a wide range of differences between French and Persian society and, more subtly, some striking analogies between them. Montesquieu was under no pressure to demonstrate respect for foreign practices that would be unacceptable under what he later calls moderate governments. The Persian Letters vividly portrays how the lives of women and eunuchs in the harem, in the seraglio, our primary window into Persian society, are manifestly based on lies and compulsion. But Montesquieu indulges the self-satisfaction of his Western readers only to bring them face to face with their own vanities and the hollowness of authorities they trust and revere. Montesquieu's foreign observers deflate French moral, political, and religious authority and implicitly challenge contemporary standards in all aspects of Western life. French government, the church, the academy, French sexual mores, social ambition, even the admiration of exotic foreigners and the pretense of openness are exposed to satiric scrutiny. In all of this, the enlightenment of the reader is Montesquieu's aim. The reader, who easily sees through the pretenses of foreign characters, progresses to dispel the illusions of vanity closer to home. But does the Persian Letters illuminate the truth? Montesquieu asks the reader in his reflections on this work to, quote, notice that the entire charm of the work is in the contrast between things as they really are and the singular, naive, or bizarre way in which they were perceived, end quote. The letters are an early precursor to the Spirit of the Laws, and the influence of Descartes is visible in both works. Montesquieu's assessment of what is knowable, namely the relations among things rather than in their intrinsic natures, is Cartesian. But unlike Descartes, Montesquieu displays his genius in reflections upon the complexities of human lives and the moral relations among individuals. The brilliance of the Persian Letters becomes apparent only to the reader who submits to Montesquieu's skill in implicating her or him while seeming merely to entertain. It is easy to dismiss his characters as devices to make the novel intriguingly exotic and yet accessible. The book opens up to the reader who accepts Uzbek and his friend Rika as men like those we know, and the wives, Roxanne, Fatima, Zachi, Zealous, and Zephys, as recognizably human women. Montesquieu invites us to see that these characters are constrained by versions more or less akin to the prejudices to which we too are chained. It is unclear what complete liberty would look like. It is easier to see how one can escape various types or consequences of slavery one at a time. The process is aided by our habitual delight when we recognize the blindness and flaws of beings like ourselves. But it is only when one recognizes in oneself and one's society absurdities similar to those represented in the letters that the significance of the work becomes clear. Such recognition is the beginning of a potentially liberating sort of education that surpasses mere seeing. To read the letters well is to experience a sort of moral habituation in releasing oneself from hidden bondage. Such habituation is crucial for Montesquieu's European readers, and us, whose chains are bedecked with the seductive appearance of liberty, and thus harder to discern. Much of the material included in the letters is comic, or rather satirical. The final letters may be thought of as tragic, at least if the reader finds the characters and the plights of Uzbek and his favorite wife, Roxane, compelling. Uzbek, who counted upon Roxane's love, although he doesn't claim to return it, fulfills his vow to return to Persia even though he knows once he does so, he will die. He must reclaim the harem as his own. Roxane thinks she has found true love. At least she has found a lover of her own choosing. She is caught with her young lover, and he is slain by the guards of the harem. The drama attains its height when Roxane avenges her lover's death and then, Phaedra-like, poisons herself, dying as she writes of her defiant last acts in a final letter to Uzbek. Are these two characters heroic enough to compel pity and fear? To romanticize Roxane's virtue by endowing it with tragic significance would blind us to the fact that the tragedy of the harem is a kind of emotional luxury which results from the peculiar constraints of life in a seraglio. Roxane was compelled to conceal herself. Her rebellion and the martyrdom she embraces are the result. In Love Matters, Montesquieu anticipates that his reader enjoys relative liberty. His contemporaries, like ourselves, would note with sensible relief that Uzbek's and Roxane's experience is unlike their own. Uzbek's wives submit not to the dictate of a god or of nature, the powers that engender the deepest tragedies, but to arbitrary and thus tyrannical convention. Their fate is revealing because of the terms in which it is expressed. In the last letter of the book, Roxane announces that she has reformed Uzbek's laws, and by implication the laws of the seraglio, quote, by those of nature, end quote. She's no philosopher, but she knows enough about nature to see that the use of force to compel a collection of young women to submit to the authority of a phantom husband and to call that submission virtue is tyrannical. Nature is not hidden. She demands to be consulted in the design of the laws. Following Montesquieu, my topic tonight is enlightenment, a state that is probably different from wisdom and perhaps scarcely less elusive. Enlightenment, as Montesquieu approaches it, offers guidance in the recognition of natural constraints and the promotion of human liberty in both the West and the East. His Persian letters is designed to illuminate the chains that make all of its readers to varying degrees unfree. Is freedom an end worth seeking? The answer is no argument. Since we cannot bear to be slaves, we had better see what freedom demands. The first part of this lecture on virtue makes use primarily of Uzbek's letters. Is virtue natural? If not, is what is called virtue simply a fraud, tyrannically imposed? The second part is on religion and faith, the Christian faith as well as Islam, and perhaps surprisingly, the faith in currency that is not tied to precious metals. In the third part of the lecture, I contrast Rika's response to European ways with Uzbek's. Is Rika's more relaxed acceptance of what may be called corruption healthier, more in accord with Montesquieu's views? The fourth section heightens the question by contrasting a story of incestuous but stable love with the revolt in Uzbek's seraglio. Despite his liberal education, pride chains Uzbek to his seraglio and to prejudices that enhance his suffering. Uzbek's situation, though extreme, is exemplary. Pride sets limits to enlightenment. Once we identify vain presumptions, we can seek release from them. Comedy or satire helps facilitate this release, but it is only a beginning. Ideas of unequivocal good and pure beauty, even wisdom, are like a harem of unfulfilled wives who compete for limited devotional energy and cannot be simply reconciled or finally possessed. Can societies change their expectations to align with nature so that desired and practical ways of life seem good? Can individuals? Part 1, Tyrannical Virtue. The Persian Letters begins with a letter from the most prolific of the writers, Uzbek, who writes to explain to a friend back home in Isfahan the reason for his travels. Uzbek is on his way to France with another friend, Rika. They are the first to have left Persia, Uzbek says, to seek wisdom, sagesse. An oriental light both enlightened and limited them in their flourishing homeland, he continues. But the two friends are seeking knowledge, connaissance, beyond her bounds. What is good or good enough for Persia constrains them excessively. Shortly afterward, Uzbek reveals that his original reason for exiling himself had more to do with prudence or maybe desperation than with learning. He dared to be virtuous, he says, in a corrupt court, and thereby made enemies among the ministers without gaining the favor of the Sultan. Montesquieu does not delay long to indicate that his main character's love of learning begins with personal interest. Only by pretending to have a love of learning did he, in fact, develop such a love. Uzbek expects his addressee to grasp the nature of his virtue and to see that there was no place for it in the Persian court. He seeks a more congenial environment while he pursues further learning, but he is unaware of the chains that bind him to his home, including the convictions it has bred in him. The subsequent letters are diffuse and loosely organized, presented in an order that departs from chronology as indicated by the dates on each. Rika and Uzbek write to one another when they are separated. They write to a young Turk named Reddy, who imitates them by traveling to Venice, where the clouds are lifted from his eyes. The letters between Uzbek, Rika, and a variety of others, including the members of Uzbek's abandoned seraglio, demonstrate a gradually increasing awareness of European, especially French, ways and of natural tendencies in man that each nation reflects and distorts. Uzbek, the more scientifically inclined of the two Persian travelers, seems engaged in a kind of informal comparative social inquiry. While he makes occasional forays into Cartesian science, for the most part, politics, economics, and the relations between women and men occupy his mind. He generalizes from what he has seen and reasoned through to talk about laws and justice, for example. Rika, by contrast, focuses on the details of French society, including fashions and personal habits. While Uzbek becomes more at odds with himself throughout the novel, Rika, who clearly enjoys the society of French women, seems almost to become European, for better and for worse. Many of the letters to and from Uzbek refer to virtue. When he says he dared to be virtuous in the Persian court, he indicates that he had to leave because of the corruption of others. By contrast, Uzbek claims that his eunuch exists only to obey and would have no soul apart from Uzbek's will. Similarly, he accuses one of his wives of pride in what he calls unfree virtue, and goes on to say that she does not deserve to live except in the seraglio, where she is guarded against the weaknesses of her feminine nature. Like women, the eunuchs who guard women lack freedom. They are mere instruments of their master's will, which enable him to compel his wives to behave in accord with the virtue they lack. Uzbek's free choice of virtue is presumably illustrated by the danger he confronted in the Persian court. His departure is the only piece of convincing evidence that he acts freely. Yet Uzbek's conviction that genuine virtue is a standard that can govern those who govern others lies deep. Moreover, he claims in a letter to his favorite wife, the one who resisted his advances longest, that even the French women whose lack of purity horrifies him would not go so far as to violate their marriage vows, I'm quoting now, for they all have engraved in their hearts an impression of virtue which education weakens but does not destroy, end quote. In accord with this view, he develops a lengthy defense of the idea that virtue is natural. His complex account of natural virtue is embedded in a story about a tribe of troglodytes, cave dwellers, written to satisfy his friend Mirza, who has heard him say that, quote, men were born to be virtuous, end quote. There are no eunuchs and no harems among this rather primitive people. Uzbek's troglodytes are descendants of ancient beings who, according to historians, more resembled beasts than men. At first, they are, quote, wicked, méchant, and ferocious. Their foreign king tries to correct their behavior by force and is killed when they rebel. This leads to a series of atrocities which finally subsides when only 2 troglodyte men who, quote, love virtue, remain living along with their families. The wickedness of all the others has destroyed them. The survivors teach their children that their own interest is always bound to the common interest, that, quote, to try to separate these interests is to invite ruin, that virtue is not costly or painful, and that justice for others is a blessing for ourselves, end quote. The troglodyte families intermarry, multiply, and continue to live prosperously and peacefully as if they were a single family. They have no organized government, and on the rare occasions when someone is suspected of a bad action, they merely wish him a long life, presumably one in which he will repent. At some point, they are attacked by outsiders. Despite their lack of political organization, they fight well, each dying man sacrificing himself for those he loves. When they grow to be more numerous and wish to make the most virtuous among them king, he weeps, fearing that they will substitute mere law-abiding for virtue. Quote, would you have an act deemed virtuous, he laments, because I required it when it would have been done without me by natural inclination, end quote. Either he will have nothing to do as a ruler, or the natural inclination he refers to is too weak to be counted upon. The claim that one's individual interest is bound with the common interest is rationally defensible if it is qualified. For the most part, individuals are dependent upon society. The peaceful troglodyte society may include criminals, self-interested individuals who exploit others, but as long as they are few, they thrive alongside their victims and do not destroy the whole, or at least they could. Moreover, the troglodytes who live without government live very simply, as much without luxuries and learning as without rulers. They work the land, presumably devoting most of their time and energy to satisfying basic needs. They seem to be monogamous, maybe simply because of their poverty. They resemble the Romans under an even more subtle version of Numa, a leader who has taught them about gods without claiming authority for himself. If anyone like them ever existed, Uzbek, by the way, claims they're a real tribe and that they lived in Arabia. It is not clear what support their example offers for the claim that virtue is natural to men and women in civilized societies. The virtuous troglodytes provide an extreme contrast with their predecessors, the memory of whom is kept alive through stories. Evidently, men and women may choose between malice and self-destruction on the one hand, and decency and prosperity on the other. Nature seems to allow for both. But the gentler society is the more rational because it is successful, and thus more in accord with the way things are. Has Uzbek forgotten about this account when he insists that his wives and eunuchs must obey his will absolutely to be worthy of life at all? Uzbek's position is not self-contradictory so long as he can claim for himself extraordinarily superior virtue. Since Persian society in general is corrupt, only a virtuous man can guide others so that their instinctual virtue is not overwhelmed and distorted. Uzbek generalizes. A father, he claims, is, quote, the image of the creator of the universe, who, although he can direct men by his love, does not neglect to attach them still more closely by hope and fear, end quote. In the case of the seraglio, the cost to some is enormous. To serve their master's end, the eunuchs are, quote, made to fall below and deprived of humanity, in one slave's words, in order to fulfill the noble duty of guarding the harem. Even when Uzbek was at home, the women had to compete for a scarce commodity, their husband's love and affection. With him away, all he can offer is exhortation and false praise. Uzbek ignores at his peril the danger of forcing a sacrifice for which there is no reward. The only benefit any of his wives reports from her situation is that her imagination has kept her freer than her spouse. While he admits, to a male friend, of course, that he does not love his wives, he demands their fidelity, worries over them to the point of illness, and provokes them to false professions of love. He experiences any threat to his authority as master as akin to the peril of the slave who fears castration. Along with Rika, Uzbek considers French men's renunciation of their authority over women debasing to their sex. He cannot be fully a man if he loses the harem he has left behind. In the Persian letters, Montesquieu suggests that pride is intimately bound up with eros. The work directly challenges Uzbek's claim to virtue. His pride is misplaced. What his government provides for in the Seraglio is sexual pleasure on the one hand, his, and he says that that's waned over time, ambition and self-assertion on the other, that of his wives. In Uzbek's Seraglio, where wives are not isolated from one another and normally not terrorized, they vie for the only distinction obtainable, their husband's preference. These women are no fools, and they reflect articulately upon the situation they find themselves in when he leaves Persia. His absence enhances and exposes the situation that characterized the Seraglio all along. Letter 3 is an early warning of what is to come. Zachi reminds Uzbek of her success in the competition for his passion in vivid and somewhat pornographic terms, obviously in the attempt to reestablish her power over him from afar. In letter 7, another wife, Fatima, observes, I'm quoting, "It is difficult for a man to make himself loved, and it is easier for you to obtain from the mortification of our senses that which you could not dare to gain by your own merit," end quote. She sees that submission is necessary to enforce the sensual deprivation which artificially promotes passion. When Uzbek was there, his response to his wife's efforts helped maintain the illusion that love was the reward the wives earned. To maintain the harem in Uzbek's absence requires a rigid system of authority to keep his wives in utter dependence. In their letters, his wives complain, hoping for redress, of their humiliation at the eunuch's hands and of their overt cruelty. The women's insubordination grows. References to love become rarer, and to virtue vanish. If love is possible, the Seraglio does not seem the place to seek it. Corrupt French society presents different challenges. There, fidelity is rare and jealousy simply inspires contempt. Uzbek is open to the possibility that there is occasionally a genuinely good marriage, which depends upon two people discerning and forming an attachment to merit, or at least a confluence of tastes, but he doesn't seek such an attachment for himself. Late in the book, Uzbek refers to France as a barbarous region. He castigates the horrid crimes of the West, and he contrasts them with the celestial purity of Persian women. Nonetheless, he carefully observes the more relaxed society he finds himself living in, and he reflects upon its implications. When he reasons on the foundations of ethics and politics, his reasoning seems cogent. He argues for the advantages of liberal divorce laws on the grounds that underpopulation results from marriages between ill-suited couples. Enforced celibacy and polygamy, he notes, have similar results. Uzbek does not recognize that he is more a despot than a true monarch, although he says at one time that maybe there's no true monarch anywhere. Nonetheless, his reflections on law and justice demonstrate a growing preference for republican government over despotism. I'm quoting now. "I have often asked myself," he writes to Redi in Venice, "what sort of government most conformed to reason? It has seemed to me that the most perfect is that which attains its goal with the least friction, thus that government is most perfect which leads men along paths most agreeable to their propensity and their inclination, end quote. He goes on to say, quote, I do not see that the police regulations or the principles of justice and equity are any better observed in Turkey, Persia, or the lands of the Mogul than in the republics of Holland and Venice, even in England. I see no fewer crimes committed there, no evidence that men intimidated by the magnitude of punishment are more submissive to the laws. I find that even the prince, who is the law, is less a master there than anywhere else, end quote. Uzbek sees not only that virtue cannot be compelled, but that force fails to rectify behavior. If he applied the moral and political understanding he articulates to his harem, the only rational response would be to seek to disband it. But he would have first to doubt that his authority is based on merit. Instead, he makes no complaint when his eunuchs continue to buy beautiful women for his harem. When he hears of his wives' resistance to his government and their efforts to seek illicit pleasure, he is horrified. He chides his wife in an effort to reestablish order until things get worse, and then he orders the unlimited use of force. He is blind enough to think he can regain his harem by violence. To avoid disaster, evidently, enlightenment about one's passions and prejudices is more important than the sort of enlightenment comparative social science affords. 2 points emerge quite clearly from Uzbek's reflections upon virtue and his insistence on his own. 1, although there may be a natural inclination toward virtue, understood as harmonious social practices, nature does not guarantee and may not effectively support love of the good. And 2, insofar as it promotes attachment to both privileges and prejudices, inflated pride hinders genuine enlightenment. Uzbek's insistence on his superiority enables him to preserve profound ignorance of his situation, even while he reasons well about general principles that govern the harem as well as any other society. Uzbek's pride renders his so-called virtue tyrannical. Part 2. Religion, vanity, and faith. Part of the reason for Uzbek's blindness about his own affairs is his attachment to Islam, for he persists in thinking his religion true and thus superior to that of the Europeans. His religious convictions feed his pride and color his understanding of virtue. Uzbek observes that the despotic constraints in the Persian seraglio aim at a purity of virtue that seems entirely absent from the freer and more corrupt French society, and he tells his wives that they cannot be too pure. Purity and beauty go together. He describes French women as merely pretty, while Persian women, more shielded and less vivacious, are beautiful. Purity requires unquestioning adherence to a standard, the absence of any admixture of self-interest, maybe even of rationality. To underline this point, Montesquieu follows Uzbek's series of letters explaining the history of the troglodytes with an exchange between him and the mullah Muhammad Ali on Muslim laws Uzbek cannot understand. Why must Muslims not eat swine and other meats that are called unclean? Uzbek asks. Why must we incessantly wash our bodies? He suggests, respectfully, that the idea of uncleanness comes from the senses, and he wonders whether we ought to trust their evidence. The mullah responds somewhat harshly, with an emphasis on how little Uzbek, like any mere man, knows. The only explanation he gives of uncleanness is a story. In Noah's Ark, a pig sprang from the excrement of an elephant and sneezed, giving birth to a rat. Both, therefore, are unclean. Cats, by the way, are filthy too. They come from the sneeze of a lion. The message of the mullah's letter is clear. Stop trying to think through Muslim law, just obey. Uzbek later observes that all religions aim at obedience and concludes that religious intolerance is therefore madness. Quote, a full eclipse of reason, in his words. Yet far from anticipating that he could accept a different religion himself, he expects Islam someday to be universally accepted. He sees that Christianity serves similar social ends, but claims that Islam relies on the truth alone for its defense. Both the hierarchy and the dicta of the Catholic Church invite comparison with Islam. In fact, Montesquieu seems to use the resemblance between the two religions primarily to poke fun at the irrationality of the Catholic Church and its authority. He explicitly invites his readers to think of priests and monks as eunuchs, deprived of their natural manhood and thus forcibly and imperfectly turned toward unnatural ends. He points out that deference to the authority of the Pope is mixed with demands that arise from self-interest. For example, the interest in an afterlife of one on his deathbed. The political superiority of men is reinforced by papal dicta, but French women, offended at the claim that women have no need to read the Bible, publicly protest the Pope's latest bull. They do not tolerate the claim that they have no access to heaven. Uzbek, a good Muslim, undoubtedly agrees with the objectionable view. Even easygoing Rika says he does. Both societies, not only the Persian, have despotic tendencies, albeit to different degrees. In France, the despotism of the church combines with the despotism of the king, but both are to some extent balanced by lax, not necessarily liberating, social customs. From the point of view of Christianity, impurity, or the mixture of petty self-interest with the pursuit of the good, or vanity, is vice. Like Islam, Christianity aims for purity of morals, but the vice of vanity is widely tolerated in French society, and it can work wonders. It brings pleasure to many. It diffuses arrogance, and it promotes economic prosperity. The King of France is wealthier than the King of Spain, Rika reports, I'm quoting, because his wealth is extracted from the vanity of his subjects, which is more inexhaustible than any mine, end quote. More than a joke, this refers to the endless desire for unnecessary goods that fuels the economy. Vanity is a quality that can be good in moderation and distinctly annoying when it is taken too far, Uzbek observes. In any case, it is no more perfectly suppressed than self-interest, and it takes on as wide a variety of forms. In Persia, it is attributed to Uzbek's wives by a eunuch who claims that women are arrogant unless they are permitted to be vain. But it is not primarily, Persian wives who are inclined to arrogance. Eunuchs and the sultan or lord of the seraglio, like all despots, are characteristically arrogant. Insofar as it allows room for natural tendency, vanity may be preferable. Neither high nor base, it is merely appropriate to prideful and partial beings in conditions of partial liberty. There are, of course, dangers, for vanity involves an inaccurately high opinion of oneself. But where it is widespread, it is to some extent self-correcting, for merely vain individuals may be denied the power to compel another to accept their opinion in place of one's own. Virtue is not so much natural as forced pretense is dangerous, and the use of force to uphold it produces volatile discontent. Rika spends a good deal of space in his letters poking fun at French fashions, the attempts of women, especially older women, to look young and beautiful, and the concern with reputation of otherwise idle and empty-headed young men. A general praises his own and his troops' poetic abilities to a council of war and the confidence that they compensate for military defeat. The satirical descriptions entertain readers and perhaps make us more tolerant. To recognize the same tendencies in oneself is, of course, harder, a test of the power of humor. But responsible and serious people seek to align their claims with truth, do they not? Rika's letters satirize intellectual vanity even more harshly than personal vanity. According to Rika, French scholars write books that are good only as soporifics or emetics. An impoverished alchemist, he reports, who lives in a garret, sure he has transformed base metal into gold, drags Rika around Paris to spend lavishly the wealth he is counting upon. The alchemist is a pitiable fool. But his plight is no different from that of French society in general under the economic policies of the Scot John Law. Because France's economic problems were desperate, King Louis XIV approved the adoption of Law's rather modern policies: the printing of paper currency with no gold backing, the creation of a national bank, and the public sale of shares in a trading company with an expectation of future profits. These policies created a speculative bubble, which burst, resulting in economic collapse. Belief in the value of inflated currency is just as irrational as devotion to false moral standards. Like the priests, law managed to make people believe in value where there was none. But wealth is no mere matter of opinion. False belief in an abundance of goods that satisfy human needs is sure to be exposed. Just as the illusion of a thriving union between men and women in polygamous marriage must be maintained by authority, the power of the government was necessary to make the French accumulate illusory wealth. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu emphasizes the analogy, describing the polygamous husband as a perpetual debtor in an economically unsound enterprise. In the Persian letters, sex is emblematic of the way both physical and psychic need and irrational pride are bound together in human nature. An inflated economy, like an empty marriage, similarly leads from deprivation to humiliation. But it will continue until subjects rebel. When vain individuals, almost all of us, display their weaknesses by indulging in empty claims of their own worth, it is comical. When people are compelled to accept empty claims to truth by a worldly authority, they are no more than slaves. Yet no political authority is based simply on truth. Any successful hierarchical ordering in human society requires imagination to support it. Quote, "Our imagination adapts itself to the customs, mœurs, of the country in which we live," end quote. That's Uzbek. And the imagination can be molded to adapt even to bizarre and irrational customs. A ruler can mold his subjects' imaginations in such a way that they are more or less likely to live well. As Rika says, I'm quoting, "The soul of the sovereign is a mold which forms all others," end quote. Unlike Uzbek, Rika willingly allows himself to be formed by Parisian society. Part 3, Rika's adaptation to corruption. Perhaps Rika, the laid-back friend of Uzbek, is the true hero of the book. He lacks the obstinate pride of Uzbek and is altogether more flexible. It is not only his character that is different, he's younger than his friend. Besides, he has left behind no harem, only a lonely mother who blames Uzbek for depriving her of her son. Rika is less theoretically inclined than Uzbek and more consistent. He appreciates the openness of French society because he sees there not only a corrective to Persian despotism, but, and primarily, an opportunity to enjoy the society of women. He says, quote, "I have become acquainted with women only since I have been here, and I have learned more about them in a month here than I would in 30 years in the Seraglio," end quote. He is open to quite radical ideas of the equality of power the sexes exert upon one another. He reports uncritically a Frenchman's comment that, quote, "Power would be equal if education were equal," end quote. For Rika's own part, he decides that it is not a bad thing for several men to mix socially with several women in a gathering. To please women, he observes, one must engage in a kind of banter which, quote, "seems to promise them at every instant what can be performed only very occasionally," end quote. While Rika has no trouble finding pleasure in French society, he doesn't abandon judgment. Indeed, he disapproves of quite a few things he sees. If French sexual mores provide a window into the natures of men and women, French intellectual pretenses are simply indefensible. He balks at the eternal babble of the French Academy and claims, quote, "such oddities do not exist in Persia," end quote. His enlightenment is undoubtedly incomplete, but he may be responding to the fact that unconcealed power highlights its ruthlessness, while French authorities use subtler means. However inconsistent, his musings about nature, Rika's attitude seems rational. He's quite willing to give up the uncertain prospects he may have had for happiness in Persia for the moderate pleasures and relatively harmless vices immediately available to him in Paris. In the entire work, Uzbek's younger friend seems to be the man whose ideas are least tainted by prejudice. Unlike Uzbek, Rika reflects upon his own tendency to let irrational beliefs govern him. He laments that superstitious men in all places, including Muslims, quote, drift constantly between false hopes and absurd fears, end quote. Since he enjoys more than anything else the time he spends in French soirées, he overcomes any superstitious fear that might have restrained him and distorts the teachings of his religion to assure his success. To satisfy the curiosity of a Parisian coquette, he composes his own rather scandalous fictional account of harem life. Then he goes on to share the story with Uzbek, who never responds. Rika presents the story within another. It is presumably told by a Persian woman, Zulema Latifziz, who knows the Quran by heart. Her story features a noble but unhappy slave in a seraglio that is more like a prison. When she, the wife, reproaches her husband, he slays her in anger. Rika makes the husband an ogre. He is despised and hated for his defensive harshness, as well as for his inability to satisfy his 13 wives. Ibrahim is worse than a caricature of Uzbek. Rika exaggerates the situation in Uzbek's harem knowingly, I believe, in part to warn Uzbek of troubles to come. Rika's story, like Zachi's story of Uzbek's wives' competition, is rather racy. When the virtuous Aeneas, that's the wife's name, dies, she goes straight to heaven and finds herself in possession of an all-male seraglio. At first, she loses herself in enjoyment of the attention of a pair of indefatigable, angelic husbands. Once she is sensually sated, she turns her attention to the plight of the other members of the harem from which she was liberated by death. In an effort to reform the despotism under which they live, she sends them one of the super-virile males who attend her, disguised as their husband Ibrahim. The false Ibrahim sends his true counterpart far, far away to facilitate his endeavors. Soon the wives abandon their veils and move about freely, for guards are no longer necessary to maintain their fidelity. Over the 3 years the false Ibrahim spends with them, 36 healthy new babies are born. When their disappointingly mortal husband returns, the wives repudiate him, knowing full well what they are doing. The Parisian woman who is the primary audience for Rika's story would have no patience with life in a harem. In this book, only the wives of the false Ibrahim accept polygamy without complaint. Rika's story displays a sympathetic recognition of women's desires, and it honors women. The storyteller is learned and pious, and Aeneas is noble from the start. In death, she is generous. While pointing to the possibility that needs are not entirely independent of virtue, Rika acknowledges that women too desire honor and may be worthy of it. Rika must hope Uzbek will heed all this. Rika's story emphasizes that inhuman powers alone could fully satisfy the desires of the women in a harem, all of them. But Uzbek is already intellectually aware of the problem. In fact, earlier he wrote to Reddy, I'm quoting, "I see the good Mussulman as an athlete, destined to compete without let-up, but who, overburdened and weakened by his first efforts, languishes even on the field of victory and finds himself, so to speak, buried under his own triumphs. Among us, it is common to see a man in a huge seraglio with but a very small number of children. Moreover, these children usually are feeble and in poor health and share their father's languor," end quote. Uzbek does not celebrate his escape from the situation, although he worries about the disproportion between the powers and the obligation of Persian husbands. Rika is a bachelor who enjoys his lack of obligations. Although he admires honor, he thinks more about freedom, and he is free to acknowledge that the truth about the seraglio is that it promotes not virtuous purity, but unnatural suppression. Similarly, Rika describes the inclusion of papal law into the French as, quote, a new form of servitude, end quote. Rika never gives an account of his liberalism, and there is no evidence that he thinks through the implications of his choices. He avoids moralizing. He comments, for example, that while in Paris there are some virtuous women, they are, quote, all so ugly that one would have to be a saint not to hate virtue, end quote. Like most French husbands, he seems to accept widespread infidelity as a fact. I'm quoting again. Any husband desiring to possess his wife to the exclusion of others would be considered disruptive of the public happiness, end quote. Like the true Abraham, jealous husbands in French society, he notes, provoke contempt. He seems content to assess fidelity as either vain pretense or the fate of the physically repulsive. Uzbek's fate seems to justify Rika's embrace of corruption, for it highlights the natural constraints that render the aspirations of a master of a seraglio downright foolish. But Uzbek's error is in part the result of an attachment to nobility, which Rika admires without pursuing for himself. Laws that deny human nature, both the appetitive aspects of that nature and the desire for distinction, are ineffective and irrational. Uzbek is more complex than Rika, primarily because his attachment to the seraglio is in part a distorted love of the noble. His story is more revealing than Rika's. He suffers not merely because he is proud and unreasonably attached to his position of despot, but because he wants desperately to exemplify higher human ends. Glory is essential to humans, Uzbek claims, I'm quoting. The desire for glory does not differ from the instinct in all animals for self-preservation, end quote. Glory requires recognition from others for some splendid action, usually a sacrifice of the low for the sake of something higher. But is there an end that enlightened reflection can defend? There are, of course, a variety of ways men and women seek glory and strive to be worthy of it. Scientific learning, political power, athletic prowess, and physical beauty all come to mind. Uzbek sees that in different social contexts, quote, imagination and education modify the passion for glory in 1,000 ways, end quote. But when he reflects on the relationship between honor and freedom, he worries that Persian despotism robs men of the drive toward nobility. He fails in his own case to distinguish honor from imprudence. Nonetheless, his progress in enlightenment, his reflections on the differences among customs and on the reasons some support human happiness and some destroy it, provide the basis for a more moderate, rational, and perhaps dignified morality. Unlike Rika, Uzbek has indeed become a lover of learning of a certain modern scientific sort, and his reasoning is sometimes quite radical. Like Montesquieu in the sphere of the laws, Uzbek identifies justice as the proper relations between things as they are. In a letter to Reddy, he goes on, quote, even if there were no God, we ought to love justice always, which is to say, to try to resemble that being of whom we have such a beautiful idea, and who, if he existed, would necessarily be just, end quote. Uzbek's reflections on justice have encouraging implications. His beautiful idea of justice presumably provides a standard that is eternal and rational, and therefore both worthy of human aspiration and knowable by all. Uzbek's learned reflections are wide-ranging. He frequently emphasizes the power of material causes. He claims, for example, that, quote, the soul, while united to the body, is continually tyrannized by it, end quote. He defends scientific reasoning against the narrow-minded objections of his friend Reddy, who who worries about the effects of technology. This maybe isn't so narrow-minded, but quote, "I am in constant fear that ultimately someone will succeed in discovering some secret which will furnish an even more efficient way to kill men by destroying whole peoples and entire nations," end quote. Later in the same letter, Rika proclaims, quote, "Happy in their ignorance are the children of Mohammed," end quote. Uzbek argues in response that a kingdom in which one allows only the arts necessary for cultivation would be miserable. Quote, "They would rapidly decay, and the state would become so feeble that any petty power could conquer it," end quote. The conclusion he draws is that one must embrace scientific reasoning and try to compensate for its dangers as they arise. We can compensate for the dangers only if we can recognize what is more or less conducive to good human life, to thriving human life. With respect to humans in general, Uzbek's reasoning leads him to argue against celibacy and for liberal divorce laws on the grounds that the alternatives suppress population growth and lead to unhappiness. At the same time, Uzbek finds moral flexibility like Rika's distasteful, and he rejects physical need, vanity, and fleeting preferences as the sole bases for sexual interaction. To correct sexual mores in light of nature must not be to reduce humans to machines, to animals, or to puffed-up self-deluders who exploit others' desires for romance. Even Uzbek's argument in favor of divorce hints at his hope for the possibility of conjugal happiness, but he doesn't elaborate. In a more tolerant regime, he hopes, even imperfect humans may preserve their dignity. Laws may be framed to acknowledge the physical aspects of our nature while they treat citizens as beings capable of choosing ends, perhaps glorious ends. Such laws raise men and women above beasts and automata, but is there room in these enlightened reflections for love? The gap between Uzbek's intellectual development and his government from afar of his subjects exemplifies the problem I have tried to outline: how to reconcile the material aspects of human nature with the love of glory. It also reveals the secret chain of pride that binds Uzbek to his wives, the objects of his erotic attachment, even while he denies that he loves them. He doesn't claim to understand what he calls this, quote, secret jealousy, end quote, that consumes him, his words. Uzbek's reflections on the institutional defects of the seraglio should be sufficient to show him that it makes no sense to allow his own worth and happiness to depend upon his success as a master. What he calls the beautiful idea of justice is apparently not enough to give his life meaning. There are, of course, practical problems. Uzbek could not easily disband his harem. But the problems are not merely practical, and Rika's charm is superficial. Neither of the two friends is simply the hero of the work. The interplay between them presents the reader who sympathizes with Uzbek's romantic aspirations with a question. Is there an appropriate way to manage attachments that threaten to destroy us and without which life seems unbearably flat? Part 4. Romantic heroism, Part 4 short. Incestuous love, tragedy in the seraglio. One way to articulate the alternative Rika and Uzbek present to the reader concerns whether erotic love is a mere preference for one or several of various goods, or the aspiration for a higher comprehensive good. Montesquieu does not address the possibility of a love of the good simply, but in one letter written to Uzbek from his friend Ibn in Smyrna, he does provide an opportunity to reflect upon true and supposedly natural romantic love. It involves brother-sister incest. The letter in question contains the history of the lovers Apheridan and Astarte, a brother and sister who are Gebras, or Zoroastrians. The word Gebra really means unbeliever, so it's a pejorative term. Their sect endorses marriage between siblings. Their love survives terrible challenges, legal stricture, Astarte's temporary conversion to Islam and marriage to a eunuch, poverty, even slavery. The Gebra couple has survived their trials and currently lives peaceably in Smyrna. The story appears to be a celebration of their natural love. Nature evidently knows no laws, but it does provide a sort of standard. It is difficult to imagine a society in which brothers and sisters consistently marry, but the Gebra couple seems to be a model of decency and even heroism, at least in Ibn's view. Is the love of Ephedrine and Astarte truly natural? To some extent, their charmingly romantic commitment may be a consequence of precisely the oppression that makes it fragile. Just as Montesquieu has Uzbek's wife Fatima describe in one of her letters how the mortification of the senses promotes passion, Astarte says that she must believe in Islam because she has given up so much for it. She later breaks with Islam, escapes her eunuch husband, and commits herself entirely to her brother. She is utterly dependent upon him. She and Ephedrine together give up too much, their freedom, their country, perhaps even their child, to doubt that their love for one another is genuine. They must believe in it to maintain their sense of their own worth. French social customs, with all their defects, seem more honest, if less inspiring. And yet, the story of Ephedrine and Astarte is refreshing. It is the one clear example in which convention has not determined the shape of a pair of lovers' lives. Ephedrine's determination to seek and to maintain what he believes makes life worth living is hard to dismiss. Montesquieu does not hesitate to paint a compellingly attractive picture of sibling incest. Like the account of the virtuous troglodytes, this story provides an image of natural goodness that is absent in liberal alternatives to despotic authority. Ibn's story presents incest as a model for erotic love of the good, or an image. Ephedrine's and Astarte's romance contrasts sharply with Uzbek's relations with the members of his harem. Through force and isolation, Uzbek tries to make his subjects as thoroughly dependent as any lovers can be. It is Uzbek who is most thoroughly enslaved. Despite his physical distance and the intellectual distance his love of learning has placed between him and his home, Uzbek's fate is inextricably tied to that of the harem of wives he has left behind. He's shocked at the incompetence of his eunuchs and the infidelity of his wives. While he feigned interest in the sciences to protect himself, and through doing so became truly interested, his wives feigned love for him and hated him, in fact. Most of them, anyway. They, especially his favorite, Roxanne, rebel more and more openly in the course of the work. I'm quoting now. Bring to light the most deeply hidden secrets, end quote. Uzbek orders his chief eunuch. More from Uzbek. Purify this infamous place and restore its banished virtue, end quote. No reader could find the failure of this enterprise surprising. Uzbek's suffering is a direct consequence of the dramatic failure of his project of self-enlightenment. Uzbek sacrifices his freedom to the futile task of preserving his seraglio, and he looks pathetic. The self-sacrifice of his once favorite wife, Roxanne, by contrast, is heroic. Like Uzbek, she understands herself to be a virtuous subject of a corrupt and oppressive regime. The seraglio is an image of despotism, a form of authority by no means exclusively Persian. Roxanne used his prejudices to deceive her husband. After allowing him to interpret her repugnance for him as virtuous attachment to moral purity, she thoroughly convinced him of a devotion that is altogether false. In her final letter, she proudly shows herself to be the artful and intelligent governor of both Uzbek and the chief eunuch. No doubt, she loves her own heroism as much as she loves her young lover, perhaps more. When she writes to Uzbek, it is clear that she takes pleasure in the effect she imagines her words having upon him. I'm quoting, "Is it possible," she writes, "that after crushing you with sorrow, I may yet force you to admire my courage," end quote. Roxanne overturns all Uzbek's convictions about women, especially Persian women, and in a few letters nearly upstages him in the drama of the book. By distorting chronology, Montesquieu gives her the last word. But while she succeeds in emasculating Uzbek, she does not succeed in refuting him. Like Uzbek, Roxanne is a victim of her pride. She is determined to outdo him, and she suffers for it. The tragedy of the harem seems to be avoidable under moderate European rule and liberal marriage customs. There's no perfect government, but individuals who see clearly both the failures and the successes of other men and women can learn from them. Such learning challenges traditional taboos as well as objects of reverence. It opposes the emotional power of tragedy with projects for sensible reform. But can women and men find their sense of superiority in the enlightened regulation of desires in accordance with their knowledge of natural drives? Perhaps this is possible for some. What role in our lives, then, ought admiration for romance and heroic sacrifice, like that of Roxanne or of the incestuous Gebers, play? The appropriate response, given the plot of the letters, seems to be that such admiration must not delude us, as Uzbek's ideals deluded him. It cannot require the sacrifice of freedom to think clearly and to act accordingly. References to moral virtue are most often found associated with despotism in the writer's observations. By contrast, justice is linked to reason. Toleration is defended and piety satirized. Enlightenment is not uplifting, but moderately hopeful. It serves to free imperfectly rational beings not only from error, but from traps of their own making. There is much to strive for, of course. Uzbek is right. Modern science brings with it enormous advantages. But to the extent that human nature demands heroism and romance, it appears that we must continue to choose ends that reason cannot endorse. Conclusion. In his Some Reflections on the Persian Letters, Montesquieu claims that the nature and design of this work are evident. Only those who want to deceive themselves would mistake it. None of us wishes to place ourselves in this category. We may all want to deceive ourselves, however. A secret and in some fashion unknown chain links politics, philosophy, and ethics in this work, Montesquieu informs us. He is instructing the reader how the book must be read. The letters openly discuss political and ethical matters. They reflect philosophical ideas. It makes sense to look for ways these ideas and those matters are linked. Moreover, philosophy, politics, and ethics all reflect the more or less slavish character of the people among whom they are found, and from which enlightenment may free us. The secret chain of prejudice both links the letters and the characters with one another and binds the reader. To become aware of our chains precisely where we feel most free among to become aware of our chains is the true task of enlightenment, and Montesquieu writes to induce us to look for our chains precisely where we feel most free among our erotic wishes. Eros for the good is rare, and in a manner of speaking, incestuous. It is love of our own good, understood more broadly or less. Beware the ancient thinkers, Montesquieu seems to say, who seduce us into thinking we have a longing for the good simply. More likely, our secret desire for glory is at work. Montesquieu offers no eternal truths or simply best way of life to preserve with inhuman guardedness. He procures no beauties for our harem. Instead, he gives us Uzbek's ideas, many of which reflect his own, and contrasts them with Uzbek's story. His pursuit of enlightenment lifts some of the chains of prejudices from his thought, but his liberation is only as real as his ability to replace delusion with the good sense to govern himself. The problem of how to govern ourselves is complicated by the fact that we are all necessarily troglodytes, dwellers in some version of Plato's cave. Our prejudices fix us in place. Montesquieu debunks the idea that there is a place to ascend to beyond the cave. All claims of transcendence are suspect. They blind and delude us. But as we come to recognize the boundaries that constrain others' experience, it is possible to see what in our own situation resembles theirs, and so to loosen our chains and increase our awareness of the boundaries within which we live. Still, the contrast between things as they are and how they are perceived is perhaps eternal, for none of us sees quite clearly. Enlightenment takes place within the cave and is a limitless pursuit. The only people in the Persian letters who govern themselves according to reason are the troglodytes, pre-human cave dwellers who appear only in a story contrived to establish that virtue is natural. Even in the story, these exemplars of virtue maintain their character for only a few generations before they fall. The virtuous troglodytes are poor farmers whose desires are limited by circumstance. Those who live in more civilized, prosperous societies, or caves, must submit to external constraints or moderate themselves. If it appears that I am presenting the Montesquieu of the Persian letters as, after all, an ethical Aristotelian, that is true in a sense. But the moderation available to modern admirers of the troglodytes is a consequence of competition among irrational, irreconcilable attachments, rather than habituation that enables us to recognize a mean that is intrinsically good. Competition among more or less vain attachments is the only effectual means to moderating them. Hiding them in the depths of our souls is like keeping a seraglio, where compulsion alone maintains tranquility, a cave within a cave. Through knowledge of human extremes, Montesquieu proposes, moderate social and political life is attainable. Montesquieu is a descendant of Machiavelli with Aristotelian tastes. The Persian letters illuminates the persistence of irrational and destructive passions, especially in those people who, like Uzbek, seek enlightenment. Faith, romance, and the love of virtue all turn out to be empty and vain. Diotima's ladder reappears here as a set of chains of increasing weight. To ascend the ladder is to suffer delusion that enslaves by deflecting us from any functional path. Such debunking of our presumably highest yearnings may avert tragedy and promote well-being. But when we dismiss our highest yearnings, we also abandon the distinction between the base and the noble, and with it the sense that there is any goal for free humans other than to embrace our pettiness. Enlightened readers who recognize their vanity may be free from delusion, but they have a problem of crisis proportions. What is such freedom good for? Thank you.